I pressed the papers flat on the table that morning, my hands trembling more from memory than from age. Today was supposed to be the day the truth was spoken aloud, the day my family could finally hear what was left behind for them. I told myself it would bring peace. Instead, a knot of unease tightened in my chest, because when it comes to family and money, peace is often the first casualty. Tell me, have you ever watched someone you love turn a moment that should have united everyone into a battlefield of suspicion and silence? I kept looking at my son, the one who insisted on carrying the briefcase with the will. He wouldn't let it out of his sight, not even for a moment. His shoulders were too stiff, his eyes too guarded. My heart told me something was wrong, but my grief told me to wait. Then the judge asked him to read line 4 aloud. And in that single moment, everything we had been trying to hide unraveled. When he opened his mouth to read, I could hear the crack in his voice, though he tried to steady it. That moment, line 4, would not leave me, even as I try to tell this from the beginning. You see, betrayal never begins at the point of discovery. It begins in small silences, in looks that don't match words, in the way someone avoids your eyes when the truth is near. I remember the days after my wife's funeral, the house filled with the smell of condolence meals and the weight of unfinished business. My children came together under one roof for the first time in years. The rooms carried echoes of their younger selves, laughter, fights over the remote, quiet apologies whispered at night. But those echoes didn't soften the air this time. Grief had brought them back, but suspicion kept them apart. It was my eldest son who stepped forward and said, "I'll take care of the will." His tone was sharp, not out of service, but possession. He carried the briefcase, like a soldier clutching orders too tightly as if someone might snatch it away. My daughters exchanged glances, the kind that speak louder than words. I stayed silent. Part of me was grateful he wanted responsibility. Another part questioned why he insisted so quickly. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my youngest daughter. She stirred her tea more than she drank it. "Dad," she said softly, "why did Mom never tell us what was in the will? Wasn't it supposed to be equal?" Her eyes searched mine for certainty. But the truth was, her mother had told me everything. My wife believed money should heal, not divide. She wanted conditions, rules that would force our children to care for each other, to share not just wealth, but responsibility. She told me once, late at night, if they can't learn to stand together, they'll fall apart the moment we're gone. That's why line 4 existed. A single sentence meant to bind them, not separate them. Yet I dared not speak it aloud that night, not when I hadn't seen the will with my own eyes since the funeral. The next morning, my son insisted on meeting the lawyer privately. He returned later with the papers, thinner than I remembered. My heart told me something was missing, though I couldn't place it. He tapped the folder against the table and said, "We're ready. No more delays." His certainty felt like a wall closing in. During the reading, my children sat in stiff chairs around the living room. The lawyer unfolded the document and began. The words were formal, dry, yet every sentence seemed to slice deeper into the silence. When the lawyer announced that most of the estate would go to my eldest son, the air broke. My younger children shifted uncomfortably, some whispering under their breath. I glanced at the lawyer, then at the page in his hands. It felt shorter, stripped of the life my wife had poured into it. Where were her words about unity? Where was her vision of legacy as more than money? The lawyer never reached that part, because in this version, it didn't exist. Afterward, my middle son approached me. His jaw was tight, his eyes wet with anger. "Dad, this doesn't feel right. Mom wouldn't do this. Not to us." I wanted to defend his brother. I wanted to say there must have been a mistake, but deep down, I knew. My eldest son stood in the corner, avoiding everyone's gaze. He didn't argue, didn't comfort, didn't explain. He simply waited for the storm to pass, like a man who knows the fire won't touch him. That night, I lay awake in my room, staring at the ceiling. I thought about the last conversation I had with my wife. She told me she had left a message inside the will, something no one could ignore. "If they look closely, they'll see where our true inheritance lies," she whispered. I turned her words over and over in my head. Could it be gone now? Had my son taken more than just money? Had he stolen her voice? The next morning, I walked into his room. He was sitting at the desk, the briefcase beside him. I asked calmly, "Son, let me see the document." He stiffened, then forced a smile. "Dad, you don't need to worry about it. Everything's handled." "Handled how?" I asked. He looked me straight in the eyes for the first time, but his expression was unreadable. "I'm protecting what's ours. That's what Mom would have wanted." His words hit me like a blow. Not because they were convincing, but because I could hear the hollowness behind them. My wife had wanted fairness, not control. She wanted love, not power. I left the room, but not before noticing something. A second envelope sticking halfway out of his drawer, tucked beneath a stack of papers. He noticed my eyes flick toward it, and in a swift motion, he pushed it deeper, shutting the drawer with force. That was the moment I knew. Something was hidden, and sooner or later, the truth would have to come out. The memory of that envelope stayed with me. It was like catching a glimpse of smoke under a door. You couldn't yet see the fire, but you knew it was there. I tried to push the thought away, but when the lawyer sat down in our living room with the papers, I felt the unease rising again. He cleared his throat, unfolded the document, and began reading in a steady monotone. My children leaned forward, every face tense, waiting to hear what their mother had left behind. The words sounded legal, precise, stripped of the warmth I remembered in my wife's voice. She had spoken about fairness, about each child carrying a part of the burden, yet the sentences that spilled into the room painted a different picture. The lawyer read, "The primary heir to the estate, including property and financial accounts, shall be the eldest son, with discretion over division." I heard a sharp intake of breath from my daughter. She glanced at me, wide-eyed, her lips pressed together as if holding back words that might shatter the air. My middle son shook his head and muttered under his breath. Only the eldest looked calm, his hands folded neatly, his gaze fixed on the lawyer as if this was exactly how things were supposed to unfold. As the lawyer turned to the last page, I realized something was missing. The will was too short. Where were the lines about shared responsibility? Where was the part about using the inheritance to build, not divide? My wife had spent weeks drafting those words, and I had read them once myself, but now they were gone, as if she had never written them. "Is that all?" my younger daughter asked, her voice shaking. "That concludes the will as presented," the lawyer replied, slipping the papers back into the folder. The room fell into heavy silence. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. Finally, my middle son stood. "This doesn't make sense. Mom wouldn't do this. Not to us." My eldest snapped, "Are you calling me a liar?" "No," his brother shot back. "I'm saying this isn't right. She loved us all. She wouldn't just hand everything over to you." The lawyer raised his hand, trying to calm them, but the tension was already spilling out. My daughters began whispering to each other, one of them shaking her head in disbelief. I sat quietly, my heart pounding. I wanted to speak, to defend, to explain. But what could I say? If I admitted my suspicion, the entire family would fracture on the spot. If I stayed silent, I was complicit in the theft of their mother's words. Later, after everyone left the room, my youngest daughter lingered. "Dad," she whispered, "was there another will?" Her question struck me. How could she have known to ask? I forced a smile, though it didn't reach my eyes. "Why do you ask that?" "Because this doesn't sound like Mom," she said simply. She was right. Every sentence felt stripped bare, as though someone had cut out her heart from the words. I remembered her telling me, "Our legacy is not just property, it's the way we treat each other." That was supposed to be the foundation, written clearly, so none of them could forget. That night, I walked through the hallway, the house quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I stopped by the shelf where my wife used to keep her journals. She had always believed in leaving traces of her thoughts. I wondered if she had written something about the will, a note I could show the children, proof of what she wanted. But even if she had, would it matter? My eldest had already positioned himself as the authority, the one in charge. Thus, the others doubted him. Yet none of them had evidence strong enough to challenge him. All I had was memory, When I closed my eyes, I saw her sitting at the dining table, a pen in her hand, papers spread around her. She looked up at me and said, "This line will make them stop and think. It will make them realize this isn't about one of them, it's about all of them." Line 4. She had called it the anchor. But in the will that was read aloud, there was no line 4, only silence where her voice should have been. I woke the next morning with determination. If I was right, if my son had hidden the real will, then the truth would have to surface eventually. Paper trails don't disappear so easily. Lawyers keep records. Copies exist. And no matter how carefully he tried to control the narrative, something would betray him. At breakfast, I studied him. He buttered his toast calmly, spoke little, avoided everyone's eyes. To the others, it might have looked like grief. To me, it looked like calculation. I asked him, "Do you feel relief now that the will's been read?" He froze for a fraction of a second before answering, "Yes, it's done. We can move on." But his tone was too flat, too rehearsed. My daughters noticed it too. They exchanged another glance, silent but questioning. I let the moment pass, but my resolve hardened. If the truth was hidden, then it was only a matter of time before someone asked the right question, in the right place, and forced it into the open. And deep down, I prayed that when that moment came, I would be strong enough to face what it revealed about my son, and about myself. I've often wondered if silence does more harm than words. That night after the reading, I convinced myself it was better to keep the peace. But peace built on lies never holds. Within days, the cracks began to spread across the family like a wall that had been poorly mended. My younger daughter was the first to push. She came into the kitchen while I was washing dishes, the sound of water running between us. "Dad," she said, her voice steady but firm, "we need to talk about the will." I tried to deflect. "It's been hard on everyone. Maybe it's best if we let things settle." But she didn't look away. "No, it's not settling. It's tearing us apart." I set the plate down and turned to her. She had her mother's stubborn eyes, the kind that didn't flinch when searching for the truth. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Was there more to it? Did Mom leave something else?" The question hung in the air, heavier than the steam from the sink. My instinct was to protect her from the storm that would follow if I admitted my suspicion. Yet by staying silent, I risked letting her think her mother had betrayed her. Before I could answer, my eldest son walked in. His presence filled the room like a shadow. "Talking about Mom again?" he asked, his tone sharp. My daughter stiffened. "We're talking about the will." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "We heard the will. It's clear. End of story." Her jaw tightened. "It's not clear. It's wrong. She wouldn't have written it that way." Their eyes locked, and I felt the air grow hotter between them. I stepped in before the argument could explode. "Enough. We're not going to shout in this house." But my daughter's voice broke anyway. "You're hiding something. I can feel it." He barked a short laugh, but it didn't sound amused. "You always think you know everything, don't you?" He pushed off the counter and stormed out, leaving the silence behind him like broken glass. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the old photographs on the wall. My wife smiling in her garden, the children as babies, faces full of wonder. How had we ended up here, with suspicion hanging over every word? I kept replaying her voice in my head. Our legacy is how we treat each other. But in practice, our legacy had become mistrust. The following day, my middle son confronted his brother directly. I wasn't there for the start of it, but I heard the raised voices from the yard. When I stepped outside, I saw them standing nose to nose near the old oak tree. "You think you can just take everything because you're the eldest?" my middle son shouted. "I don't think—" "I know," the eldest snapped back. "That's what the will says. You heard it with your own ears. Don't twist this. You tampered with it. Admit it." Their fists clenched, their faces inches apart. I rushed over, placing myself between them. "Stop this, both of you!" But neither backed down. My middle son's voice cracked. Mom wanted us equal. She said it every day. She wrote it down. Where is it? The eldest sneered. You're chasing ghosts. Maybe you just can't accept she trusted me more. The words cut deep, not just for his brother but for me. Because beneath his arrogance I heard something else, a slip of truth or maybe guilt hidden under the bravado. Later, when the house was quiet again, I searched the study. I pulled open drawers, checked the shelves, even flipped through old notebooks. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, maybe a draft, maybe a note she had tucked away. But all I found was dust and the faint smell of her perfume lingering on the paper. I sank into her chair, exhausted. Was I losing my mind? Had I imagined her reading that line to me, that anchor she had been so proud of? Memory is a fragile thing, but I clung to it like a lifeline. The next evening, my youngest daughter approached me again. "Dad," she said softly, "I know you're protecting him, but if you don't speak, we'll all break." Her words pierced me. Protecting him. Was that what I was doing? Or was I simply protecting myself from admitting the truth, that my own son might have betrayed his mother's last wish? At dinner, the tension finally boiled over. My middle son slammed his fork down. "We can't live like this. Either we see the original draft, or we call another lawyer." My eldest snapped, "There is no other draft. Drop it." "Then show us the file," my daughter demanded. "The lawyer must have kept a copy." For the first time, my eldest hesitated. It was only a second, but it was enough. We all saw it. His hand froze over his plate, his eyes flickered, and then he forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. That pause was more telling than any argument. I sat there, my heart heavy, knowing the storm had only begun. There are moments when a single pause, a flicker of hesitation, can speak louder than words. I couldn't shake the look on my eldest son's face at that dinner table, the way his eyes betrayed something he couldn't quite bury. It was only a heartbeat, but in families like ours, where old grudges and hidden motives run deep, a heartbeat can change everything. I kept telling myself I needed proof before I spoke, but the truth was, proof wasn't what I was waiting for. I was waiting for the courage to face what proof might cost me. In the days that followed, the house became a stage set for suspicion. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. The younger ones whispered late into the night, their voices carrying down the hallway. Even the air felt weighted, as if every chair, every picture frame, carried its own judgment. One evening, I found my middle son sitting in the garage staring at the old filing cabinet. It had not been opened in years, not since we shifted papers into digital folders. Dust had settled thick on the handles. "What are you doing out here?" I asked. He didn't look at me. "If Mom left something, it has to be here. She always kept copies. She didn't trust one version of anything." I wanted to tell him to leave it alone, but part of me, the part that had stayed quiet too long, nodded instead. "Check the bottom drawer. That's where she kept things she didn't want mixed with the rest." He pulled it open with a groan of metal. Inside were envelopes, bank statements, a stack of greeting cards tied with ribbon. He sifted through, his movements growing sharper with each page that came up empty. Then he froze. A thin folder, tucked beneath the rest. He lifted it carefully, as if afraid it might crumble in his hands. Before either of us could speak, the garage door creaked open. My eldest son stood there, his expression unreadable. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low but edged. My middle son clutched the folder to his chest. "Why don't you tell us?" A muscle twitched in his brother's jaw. He stepped forward, slow, deliberate. "Give it to me." "No." Their standoff froze me in place. I could see the child in each of them, the boy who had once built forts in the backyard, the boy who had cried when the dog ran away. But those boys were gone, replaced by men locked in a struggle neither wanted to name. I forced my voice to steady. "Stop, both of you. Put it down." But my eldest reached for the folder. My middle son pulled back, and in that instant, papers slipped out, scattering across the concrete. The sound was small, but it felt like thunder. We all froze. There, among the spilled sheets, was a page with my wife's handwriting, her signature at the bottom. My heart pounded as I bent down, picking it up with trembling hands. It wasn't the final will, but it was a draft, and it held the line I had clung to in my memory. Everything is to be divided equally among my children, as fairness is the anchor of family. Silence filled the garage, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. My eldest son's face turned pale. "That's not valid," he muttered. "It's just a draft. Drafts don't mean anything." But his voice lacked the certainty it once carried. My middle son's hands shook, not from fear, but from fury. "You knew. You destroyed the real one." "I didn't destroy anything," the eldest snapped, though his eyes betrayed the same pause I'd seen at dinner. I stepped between them, holding the draft against my chest. "Enough. This family has bled enough over secrets. Tomorrow, we're taking this to the lawyer. Whatever is true will come out." That night, sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the dark living room listening to the clock tick, wondering how a family could unravel so quickly. Part of me wanted to believe my eldest son had panicked, made a desperate choice he couldn't undo. Another part of me feared something worse, that he had planned it carefully, counting on silence to protect him. When morning came, he was gone, his car missing from the driveway, his room stripped of anything personal. My younger daughter found me staring out the window. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. I placed a hand on her shoulder, though my own resolve wavered. "Now we face the truth, even if it costs us." The draft sat on the table beside us, a silent witness. It wasn't everything, but it was enough to light the path forward, and I knew the path would not be smooth. When a person vanishes in the middle of a storm, they don't just take themselves with them. They take the answers you've been desperate for, the conversations you rehearsed in your head, the chance to look them in the eye and ask why. My eldest son's absence was louder than his presence had ever been. Every room seemed to echo with the weight of what he hadn't said. I sat at the kitchen table with the draft in front of me. The words were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the kind of finality only death and ink can give. Fairness is the anchor of family. My wife had written that, and it haunted me now because fairness had become the very thing slipping from our hands. My younger daughter poured me coffee, though neither of us touched it. "Do you think he's ever coming back?" she asked softly. I didn't answer right away. I wanted to say yes, to reassure her, but the truth was I didn't know. "If he does, he'll have to face this," I said finally, tapping the draft. "Running doesn't erase ink." Later that afternoon, we went to the lawyer's office. My middle son carried the folder like it was fragile glass, his knuckles white around the edges. The building itself felt sterile, as though designed to scrub away the messiness of family disputes. But no amount of clean walls or neat furniture could soften what we were about to lay bare. The lawyer, an older man with sharp eyes, examined the draft carefully. He didn't speak for several minutes, and each second pressed down heavier than the last. Finally, he looked up. "This isn't the final version," he said, his tone measured, "but it does indicate intent. If another version exists, one that differs significantly, this draft could play a role in challenging its validity." My daughter leaned forward. "So if he destroyed the final will?" The lawyer held her gaze. "That would be a serious matter. But proving destruction is another thing entirely. You'd need more than suspicion." I felt the room tilt slightly, as though we had walked to the edge of truth only to find another collate. Proof, that word again. Proof was always what stood between knowing and justice. My middle son slammed his hand against the arm of the chair. "We know he did it. We saw his face when it fell out. That's all the proof I need." The lawyer's voice stayed calm, almost detached. "The court doesn't work on what you feel. It works on what you can show." I thought about my eldest, about the boy I had raised, the man who now carried silence like a weapon. I wanted to believe there was a reason, some desperation that had driven him to it. But wanting and knowing were not the same thing. When we left the office, the street outside felt colder than it should have been. My daughter walked a few steps ahead, her shoulders hunched. My middle son lit a cigarette he hadn't touched in years, the smoke curling around him like an accusation. "We can't let him get away with this," he muttered. I nodded, though the words felt heavier than either of us could carry. No, we can't. That night, the house was restless again. The younger ones stayed up late, voices hushed but urgent, as though plotting strategies for a war they never asked to fight. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking questions I knew had no easy answers. How had it come to this? At what point had love twisted into rivalry, trust into suspicion? I thought of my wife, of the way she used to gather the children around the table, insisting that no matter how hard things got, we had to face them together. Would she recognize us now? The next morning, a letter arrived. It wasn't handwritten, it was typed, the envelope plain. But the moment I saw the return address, my chest tightened. It was from him. Inside, only a few sentences. Don't look for me. Don't drag the courts into this. What's done is done. Let it rest. There was no apology, no explanation, just the cold finality of someone who had chosen their side. My middle son crumpled the paper in his fist. He admits it. That's as good as proof. I shook my head. It's not enough for the court. He knows that. That's why he wrote it that way. We sat in silence, the family gathered around the table once more, but the unity my wife had dreamed of was nowhere to be found. Instead, we were bound together by betrayal, by an absence that was louder than any argument. I looked at their faces, my children, my blood, and I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just about money or even about fairness. It was about dignity, about not letting silence rewrite the truth. We'll take this as far as it needs to go, I said quietly. Not because of what he's taken, but because of what's left of us. If we let this stand, we lose more than the will. We lose who we are. Their eyes met mine, one by one, some filled with anger, others with sorrow. But beneath it all, I saw agreement. We would not let this rest. People think betrayal ends with an argument, with raised voices or slammed doors. But sometimes betrayal lingers quietly, like a draft you can't quite block out. My eldest son's letter sat on the table for days, a reminder of what he had taken from us, and of how he thought silence would be enough to close the matter. I found myself rereading it at odd hours, hoping that if I looked long enough, I'd catch something between the lines. A trace of regret, a crack in his certainty, a sign he might come back. But no matter how many times my eyes traced the words, they stayed the same, firm, deliberate, and cold. My youngest daughter broke the silence first. "We can't just let this letter sit here," she said one morning, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "If he thinks this is the end, then he doesn't know us at all." She was right. The letter wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the fight he didn't want to face. We met with the lawyer again, bringing both the draft will and the letter. The lawyer read it slowly, his eyes narrowing with each line. Finally, he set it down. "This confirms one thing," he said. "Your son knew the contents of the will. The problem is, it doesn't admit to destroying it. It's carefully worded to avoid that. Still, this gives us grounds to question him formally in court. The judge will want to hear him speak." My middle son leaned forward. "And when he speaks, the truth will crack open." The lawyer hesitated. "Not always. People can lie under oath. What matters is how well we can corner him with what we have. The draft, the letter, and his behavior may be enough. But you should prepare yourselves. It won't be clean." Walking out of that office, I realized how much of life is built on stories. Not just what happened, but how it's told, how it's remembered, how it's proven. My wife's story was written in her own hand, but my son was trying to rewrite it in silence. The fight ahead wasn't just about inheritance. It was about who had the right to shape the ending. The weeks leading to the court date were restless. Every meal carried an edge of unspoken tension. The younger ones kept their distance from the eldest's memory, as if even speaking his name might invite another wound. My middle son buried himself in gathering every document he could find. Bank statements, old letters, anything that could prove intent. One night, he brought a box into the living room. "I found these in Mom's sewing cabinet," he said, setting it down with a thud. Inside were small notes, scraps of paper where my wife had scribbled reminders, recipes, thoughts. Among them was another line that mirrored the draft. All children equal, no exceptions. I held that slip in my hand and felt the weight of her voice. She had tried, in her quiet way, to make sure none of them would be left behind. But my eldest had chosen to ignore that, and now it would be a judge who decided whose story stood. The day finally came. We walked into the courthouse together, though the air between us was fractured. My daughter clutched my hand tighter than she had since she was a child. My middle son walked with a set jaw, carrying the folder as if it were both weapon and shield. Inside, the atmosphere was cold, almost clinical. Yet beneath the polished wood and formal language, lives were about to be laid bare. When my eldest finally appeared, escorted by his lawyer, I felt my chest tighten. He looked thinner, older, as if the weight of running had carved lines into his face, but his eyes still carried that same guarded steel. The judge entered, and the room shifted. Introductions were made, the case outlined. And then the moment came, the one I had dreaded and anticipated in equal measure. The judge turned to my son. "Please open the document and read line 4 aloud." For a brief second I thought he might refuse. His hand trembled as he opened the draft. The silence in the courtroom was heavy enough to break a man. Then his voice came, strained but clear. "Everything is to be divided equally among my children, as fairness is the anchor of family." The words hung in the air, my wife's words, our truth. For the first time, my son couldn't hide behind silence. He had to speak what he had tried so hard to bury. I looked at him, and for just a flicker I saw something break in his face. Not defeat, not quite, but recognition. The truth had been spoken, and no matter what followed, it could never be unsaid. When the words left his lips, the room seemed to tighten around him. It wasn't just a line from a page. It was a confession disguised as obedience. My wife's voice had returned through his mouth, and he looked as though he wished he could pull it back. The judge leaned forward, studying my son in silence for a long moment. "You've confirmed the statement," he said. "Now tell us, where is the original?" My son hesitated. His lawyer placed a hand on his arm, signaling restraint, but the pause was already too heavy. In a courtroom, silence can scream louder than words. Finally, he muttered, "I don't know. My mother may have misplaced it." That answer hung in the air like smoke. My daughter's fingers gripped mine so tightly I thought she might break them. The lawyer we had hired rose smoothly, papers in hand. "With respect, Your Honor," he began, "we have multiple notes written by the deceased in her own handwriting, all reinforcing the equal division stated in the draft, and yet the original will, which contained the same intent, has conveniently vanished. We also have this letter written by the defendant himself where he acknowledges knowledge of the document but avoids stating what became of it. That gap is no accident." The judge turned back to my son. "Do you deny ever seeing the original?" "I don't recall," he said, his tone flat. That was when the questioning shifted. Our lawyer pressed him with precision, circling like a hawk. "Did you spend time alone in your mother's study the week before her death?" "Yes," my son replied reluctantly. "Did you handle documents from her desk?" "I sorted through them." "And in sorting, did you come across the signed will?" His jaw clenched. "I don't remember." The lawyer leaned closer. "You don't remember holding the very document that would decide the fate of your entire family? That seems unlikely." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge's brow furrowed. My son's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The cracks in his defense were visible now, and everyone could see them. For me, sitting just feet away, the sight was almost unbearable. This was my child, the boy I had once taught to ride a bicycle, stumbling over words as though they were stones. But it was also the man who had tried to erase his mother's final wishes. The conflict tore at me, father and witness colliding in one body. The cross-examination stretched on. My son's lawyer fought to redirect, to soften, to suggest doubt where certainty was building. He asked about family disagreements, about supposed misunderstandings, even about whether my wife had ever expressed favoritism. But every time he pushed, our lawyer countered with scraps of handwriting, small testimonies, and the unshakable theme of fairness my wife had lived by. At one point, the judge asked me to speak. My knees felt weak as I stood, but I knew I had to. Your Honor, I said carefully, my wife was consistent. She believed her children should stand on equal ground. It wasn't about money, it was about dignity. If one had less, she wanted balance restored. That was her way. For anyone to suggest otherwise is not only false, it's an insult to who she was. The judge nodded slowly, making a note. My son didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the table, as if the wood grain might open and swallow him whole. The session ended without a ruling, but we walked out knowing momentum had shifted. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It was being dragged into the open. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. I wasn't prepared for their questions, the cameras, the flashes. My daughter shielded her face while my middle son answered curtly, "We trust the court to see what's plain." That night, the house was quiet, but not peaceful. The younger ones kept replaying the testimony, dissecting every hesitation, every half-truth. My middle son shook his head. He's cornered himself. He thought silence was safe, but now every word ties him tighter. I wanted to believe that, but I also knew courts don't deal only in truth. They deal in what can be proven, and though the tide had turned, the storm wasn't over. Lying awake, I kept thinking about my wife's note, the simple line she had written, "All children equal." She had believed fairness would hold us together, but now that very line was the wedge between us. The next day in court, things sharpened further. A handwriting expert confirmed that the draft and the notes we found matched my wife's writing. The defense tried to argue the draft wasn't binding, that only the signed original mattered. But the judge pressed again. If the draft and the notes point to one consistent intent, and the only person who could benefit from the missing document had access to it, what conclusion is the court expected to draw? My son's lawyer stammered through an objection, but the unease in his client's face was visible. The silence after each question stretched longer, and in those pauses I could almost hear my wife's voice. She had written her truth, and no amount of evasion could bury it completely. By the end of that day, my eldest was no longer just defending himself, he was unraveling. In the quiet of the courthouse hallway, I caught my own reflection in the glass door. The face staring back was older than I remembered, worn by weeks of tension, carved by lines that hadn't been there before. I thought about my wife again, how she had believed her children would honor her wishes without this theater of lawyers, questions, and accusations. Maybe she had placed too much faith in blood. Or maybe I had. The hearings had been grueling, each day peeling back another layer of truth. My eldest son, once so confident, had begun to look hollowed out, shrinking under the weight of his own contradictions. Yet even then, some part of me kept waiting for him to turn toward me, to admit, to apologize. But the look never came. As we filed back into the courtroom for what would be the final session, the air felt heavier. The judge had promised to deliver a decision, and that certainty pressed down on all of us. Reporters lined the back rows, pens ready, while neighbors who had followed the case out of curiosity whispered to one another. My daughter squeezed my hand and whispered, "No matter what, we know the truth." I nodded, though my stomach was tight. The truth is one thing, but recognition of it, by a court, by the world, is another. The judge entered, and the room snapped to silence. Papers shuffled, a gavel tapped, and then his voice carried across the room. "This case," he began, "is not merely about money or inheritance. It is about intent, fairness, and the integrity of family bonds. We have reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, the documents presented. While the original signed will is missing, the drafts and notes in the deceased's handwriting are consistent, clear, and supported by multiple witnesses. They show a persistent intent to divide her estate equally among her children." My eldest son shifted in his seat. His lawyer's face was stern, but the tension in his jaw betrayed nerves. The judge continued. "The disappearance of the original will, coupled with the defendant's access to the documents and his repeated inability to account for them, raises substantial doubt about his credibility. This court cannot ignore that pattern. Therefore, I rule that the estate will be divided equally among all surviving children in accordance with the deceased's evident intent." The words struck like a bell, final, undeniable. For a moment, I didn't move. My daughter let out a sharp breath, almost a sob, while my middle son lowered his head as if in silent prayer. Across the aisle, My eldest son sat stone still, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The judge gave a final instruction, then rose and left, the gavel echoing one last time. It was done. I thought I would feel triumph, but what I felt was heavier, relief tangled with sorrow. This wasn't a victory. It was survival. My wife's voice had been restored, but at the cost of splitting the family wide open. Outside, reporters surged forward. Questions flew. Do you feel justice was served? Do you believe your son destroyed the will? What does this ruling mean for your family? I answered carefully, choosing words that wouldn't wound further. This was about honoring my wife's truth. The court saw that. That is enough. But inside, I wasn't sure it was enough. That evening, back at the house, the younger children gathered around the dining table. It felt strange to sit there without my wife, her chair empty, but her presence thick in the air. We ate in silence for a while until my daughter finally spoke. She would have been proud we fought for her. She would have been heartbroken it came to this, I replied quietly. We didn't speak of my eldest. His absence was louder than any words. He hadn't come to the house, hadn't called, hadn't offered a glance of reconciliation. I wondered if he ever would. Later, alone in my study, I pulled out the box where we had placed my wife's notes. I read her handwriting again, steady and familiar. All children equal. It was such a simple sentence, yet it had nearly destroyed us. That night I didn't sleep much. I kept turning the ruling over in my head, not the legal words, but what they meant for us as a family. Courts can decide property, but they can't repair what's been broken inside a home. The next day, a letter arrived. It was from my eldest. I opened it slowly, bracing myself. The writing was sharp, almost angry. He claimed the court had been unfair, that I had turned the other children against him, that my wife had trusted him more than anyone else. There was no apology, no admission, only blame. I sat at the desk, the letter in my hand, and felt the weight of fatherhood like a stone. How do you fight your own blood in court and then still call him son? How do you hold him accountable without letting go completely? I did not have the answers. What I did know was that the ruling had given me one thing: clarity. My wife's wish had been honored, and my children, at least those who stood with me, could move forward with dignity. The cost was steep, but perhaps some debts must be paid in pain. When I walked outside that evening, the sky was dimming, a thin line of light fading in the west. I stood there, breathing in the cool air, thinking about what my wife would have said if she'd seen all this unfold. Maybe she would have scolded me for letting it go so far. Or maybe she would have said what she always did in times of hardship: stand tall, do the right thing, even if it costs you. That was all I could do now. Stand tall, even with one son lost to anger, and keep faith that someday, somehow, he might find his way back. The letter from my eldest son sat on the desk for days before I could bring myself to show it to anyone. I kept rereading the words, hoping a softer meaning would emerge on the second or third try. But every line carried the same bitterness. He was convinced we had conspired against him. He believed his mother's trust had been stolen. Nothing in those sentences reached for understanding. It was all accusation. At first, I didn't share it with the other children. I told myself it would only deepen the wound. But in truth, I was afraid of their anger. I wanted to protect him, even now, even after all he had done. Maybe that's a weakness fathers carry, the refusal to fully see their children's flaws until it's unavoidable. When my daughter finally found the envelope in my study, she read it quickly and set it down with a sharp exhale. He hasn't learned a thing, she said. I tried to defend him. He's hurting. He feels cornered. Her eyes met mine, steady and unflinching. And what about us? Didn't we hurt too? Didn't we lose Mom too? He didn't care about that when he tried to erase her wishes. Her words hit me harder than I expected. She was right. I had been clinging to the hope that time would soften him, but maybe time only deepened the cracks if no one tried to mend them. That week, life in the house settled into something like routine. Meals around the table were quieter but steady. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and sympathetic smiles. The case had made us the talk of the town, and though most offered support, the whispers lingered. Families torn apart always make for curious gossip. One evening, my middle son approached me while I was fixing a loose hinge on the back door. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Dad," he said, "are you going to answer him?" I paused, screwdriver in hand. "I don't know what to say." "Maybe say nothing," he replied. "He's not ready to hear you. Every word you write will only feed his anger." "But silence feels like giving up," I said. He shrugged. Sometimes silence is the only way to stop adding fuel. His practicality reminded me of his mother. She had always known when to hold back, when to let someone burn out their fury before stepping in. I wondered if she would have written to him, or if she would have waited like my son suggested. The next Sunday I sat in church, the hymns washing over me without sticking. When the pastor spoke about forgiveness, I felt the words pulling at me like a current. Forgiveness wasn't the same as forgetting. It wasn't the same as excusing. It was a way to set yourself free. But what if the person you forgave never acknowledged the harm? Was it still forgiveness, or just surrender? After the service, an older friend placed his hand on my shoulder. "I read about the case," he said softly. "Don't let pride keep you from peace. Families can heal in strange ways." I nodded, but I didn't answer. That night, I finally sat at the desk again. I took out a blank sheet of paper and stared at it for a long time. My pen hovered, but the words wouldn't come. How do you speak to a son who believes you've betrayed him when it was he who tried to erase his mother's last words? Instead of a letter, I folded the blank page and put it back in the envelope. Maybe the act of preparing to write was enough for now. Weeks passed. My eldest stayed silent except for occasional second-hand rumors. A neighbor saw him at the store. A cousin mentioned he was drinking more. Each time I heard his name, my chest tightened. I wanted to reach out, but the weight of his letter kept me anchored in place. One evening, while clearing the attic, I found an old photo album. Inside was a picture of all 3 children sitting on the porch steps, summer sun in their faces. My eldest had his arm around his sister, his grin wide and easy. Looking at it, I wondered where that boy had gone, and whether the man he became could ever find his way back. When I showed the picture to the others, my daughter smiled sadly. "I miss him too, Dad, but you can't be the only one holding the rope. At some point, he has to grab the other end." Her words stayed with me. Families survive on 2 truths: love that binds and choices that divide. My eldest had chosen distance. I couldn't close that gap by myself. Still, I lit a candle for him that night. A small act, maybe meaningless, but it felt like sending a signal into the dark. If he ever decided to come back, the light would be waiting. I used to think legacy was something carved into stone, achievements, property, the family name carried forward. But now, in the quiet of evenings when the house echoed with fewer voices, I began to understand it differently. Legacy wasn't what you left in a will or in the courthouse papers. It was what lingered in the habits of your children, in the way they spoke to one another, in the stories they repeated long after you were gone. That realization weighed heavy on me, because if that was true, what would my legacy be? A family divided, a daughter carrying more than her share of grief, a son who shouldered burdens quietly, and another son lost to anger and suspicion. One evening, while washing dishes with my daughter, she asked a question I wasn't ready for. "Dad, do you ever feel like you failed us?" The plate slipped in my hands, clattering back into the sink, but not breaking. I steadied it, and my voice. "Every day," I admitted. "But failing isn't the same as quitting. I'm still here. I'm still trying." She nodded slowly, drying the plate with a towel. "I guess that's all we can do." Later, I sat on the porch with my younger son. He had been quiet through much of the trial and its aftermath, but that night he finally spoke. "I don't think Mom ever cared about money the way he thinks she did. She cared about us being together. That was her real wealth." His words stung because they were true. All of our fighting, the hearings, the bitter letters, it all went against what she had stood for. She would have wanted Sunday dinners full of laughter, not silence and suspicion. I realized then that honoring her wasn't about defending documents or proving points in court. It was about keeping what remained of us intact. That thought pushed me to act. I began small, inviting my children to meals the way their mother used to. At first, it felt forced. The table had an empty seat we couldn't ignore, and sometimes conversation stumbled into quiet patches that no one knew how to fill. But we kept gathering, and slowly, those meals began to feel less like reminders of loss and more like steps toward building something new. Still, guilt lingered. Late at night, I would sit by myself, wondering where I had gone wrong with my eldest. Had I been too strict, too lenient? Did I miss the signs of resentment building over the years? Fatherhood never came with a manual, and even after decades, I still felt like I was guessing. One night, I found myself walking the old garden path behind the house. Weeds had taken over since my wife passed. She used to love tending that space, her hands in the soil, her smile when a new flower bloomed. I grabbed a spade and began clearing, one stubborn root at a time. There was something grounding about it, the slow work of pulling away what didn't belong. As I worked, I thought about family the same way. You couldn't force growth. You could only clear space, water the soil, and hope something good would take root. Over the next weeks, my daughter helped me revive the garden. My younger son built new wooden borders for the beds. Working side by side, we didn't need to speak much. The rhythm of shared labor filled the silence. But the space began to change, and with it, so did the air between us. Neighbors noticed too. They'd wave as they passed, some even stopping to remark how good it was to see life in the yard again. Their words reminded me that healing wasn't always private. Sometimes it rippled outward. But no matter how much we tried to rebuild, the absence of my eldest hung over us. At times, I felt like we were living with a ghost, not of someone gone, but of someone who had chosen distance. That was harder to accept. You can grieve death, but how do you grieve someone still alive, someone who has turned away? One evening, as we sat around the table, my daughter asked if we should set a place for him, just in case he showed up unannounced. My younger son hesitated, then nodded. Maybe that's what Mom would do. So we did. Every Sunday dinner, there was a chair waiting. Some weeks, it felt foolish. Other weeks, it felt like hope. As summer turned into fall, I began writing more. Not letters to send, but thoughts I needed to put somewhere. Pages filled with questions, memories, and the things I wished I had said. I didn't know if anyone would ever read them, but maybe that was part of my legacy too, leaving behind the truth, unpolished and honest, for them to find someday. I also began speaking at the community center, not about our trial, but about what I had learned. People were curious, and while I didn't share details, I did talk about choices, about how easily a family can fracture if you put money above love. To my surprise, people listened. Some even thanked me afterward, saying it made them rethink their own arrangements. It struck me that maybe my mistakes could serve as warnings for others. Through all this, I kept wondering if forgiveness would ever come. Not just from me, but from my son as well. I didn't know the answer, but I knew one thing. I couldn't build my life around waiting for him to return. I had 2 children still with me, and they needed a father present, not a man lost in regret. One night, after another long day in the garden, I sat on the porch watching the sky fade. My daughter brought me a cup of tea and sat beside me. We didn't speak for a while. Finally, she whispered, "Mom would be proud of you." I swallowed hard, staring at the horizon. For the first time in a long while, I believed her. It had been months since I last heard his voice. Not a call, not even a text. Silence had become the language between us, and though I tried to live with it, every quiet evening carried the weight of his absence. I thought maybe time would soften things, that distance might give him space to reconsider. But I was wrong. The first time I heard his name again, it wasn't through him. It was through a knock at my door. A neighbor stood on my porch holding a folded newspaper. He looked uneasy. "I thought you should see this," he said. I unfolded the page. My son's name was there, printed in black ink. A short article, just a few paragraphs, about an altercation outside a bar. No charges yet, but words like dispute, police, and violence jumped out at me. My throat tightened. I had been preparing myself for disappointment, but not like this. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak in the house reminded me of how he used to stomp down the hallway, impatient, fiery even as a boy. I stared at the ceiling, wondering where I had lost him, and more importantly, what would happen if I didn't step in now. The next morning I told my daughter and younger son. Their reactions couldn't have been more different. My daughter's face crumpled with worry. "Dad, we can't just leave him out there like that. He's still family." My younger son, though, clenched his jaw. "He made his choices. We've spent months picking up the pieces because of him. Do you really want to invite more chaos?" I didn't answer right away. Both of them were right in their own way. But that night, as I walked the garden path, I felt the weight of the empty chair we always left at the table. We had been setting it in hope. But what was hope worth if we never reached out? So I made a decision. The next morning, I went to find him. The city felt unfamiliar to me now. Faster, louder than the life I had settled into. I drove past blocks I hadn't visited in years, clutching the scrap of paper where someone had scribbled the address. His apartment building stood like a wall of gray concrete, its front door marked with peeling paint. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand hovering before I finally pressed the buzzer. There was no answer. I pressed again. Still nothing. As I turned to leave, the door opened, and there he was, my eldest son. He looked older than his years, shoulders hunched, eyes shadowed. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he muttered, "What are you doing here?" "I came to see you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He scoffed, stepping aside reluctantly. "You've seen me now. You can go." Inside, the apartment was cluttered. Empty bottles on the counter, papers scattered across the table. He moved restlessly, as if my presence unsettled him. "I read about the fight," I said carefully. His eyes flashed. "So that's it? You came to lecture me?" "No," I replied. "I came because I'm still your father." For a long moment, we stared at each other, a gulf of unspoken words stretching between us. Then, almost too quietly, he said, "You think I don't know what I've done? You think I don't hear Mom's voice in my head every time I mess up?" His fists clenched at his sides. "I hated that she trusted you more than me. I hated that you stood there in court like you knew everything. But I hate myself more for letting it get this far." Hearing him say those words was like a crack opening in a wall I thought would never break. My heart ached, but I forced myself not to reach too quickly. "Then come home," I said simply. "Not forever, not as if nothing happened. Just come sit at the table. The chair's been waiting." He shook his head, pacing. "It's not that simple. You and the others, you'll never forgive me." "Forgiveness isn't a one-time thing," I told him. "It's work. The same kind of work it takes to pull weeds from a garden. Slow, messy, and constant. But it starts with showing up." His eyes flickered then, torn between anger and longing. He didn't answer, but he didn't throw me out either. When I finally left, I wasn't sure what progress I had made. But later that week, at Sunday dinner, the doorbell rang just as we were setting the plates. My daughter glanced at me, eyes wide. My younger son stood frozen. I opened the door. There he was, standing awkwardly, hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't say much, just, "Can I come in?" The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of a wound that had been reopened, raw but alive. That night, for the first time in months, all my children sat at the same table. The conversation was stiff, the air tense, but the chair wasn't empty anymore. And in that fragile moment, I realized something. Healing doesn't arrive fully formed. It comes in fragments, in uneasy beginnings, in the choice to sit together even when it hurts. As I cleared the dishes later, I felt the echo of my wife's presence. Not in grief this time, but in the quiet reminder that love is stubborn. It refuses to let go even when everything else crumbles. After that Sunday, nothing was the same, though not in the way people often imagine when they hear the word reunion. There was no dramatic embrace, no sudden transformation that wiped away years of bitterness. What happened was far smaller, quieter, and yet to me it was more important than any grand apology could have been. My eldest son began showing up on Thursdays, never Sundays again, not at first. He claimed it was easier, less pressure. My daughter would cook extra portions, though she tried not to look too eager. My younger son, on the other hand, kept his guard up. He greeted his brother politely, but rarely stayed in the same room for long. At those dinners, the air always felt charged, like a storm hovering just outside. We talked about ordinary things, how the tomatoes in the garden were coming along, how the local store was closing early now, how my daughter's children were doing at school. Nothing important, nothing raw. But in the silences, I could feel the questions we weren't asking. Do you regret what you did? Do you still blame me? Can I trust you again? One Thursday, as he was helping me clear the dishes, my eldest son surprised me. I went by Mom's grave today, he said, his voice low. First time in years. I paused with a plate in my hand. How was it? He shrugged, avoiding my eyes. Quiet. I didn't know what to say. Felt like she wouldn't want to hear from me anyway. I set the plate down and leaned on the counter. You're wrong about that. If there's one thing your mother could never do, it was stop caring about her children. Even when you disappointed her, she never turned her heart away. He nodded, but didn't answer. That silence spoke loose, darer than words. It told me he was carrying a guilt that had nowhere to rest. Weeks passed, and slowly, the rhythm of his visits settled into our lives. My daughter began to relax a little, laughing more freely when he made a rare joke. My younger son stayed distant, though I caught him once listening from the hallway when his brother told a story. Progress, if you could call it that, came in inches. But just as I started to believe we were moving forward, the ground shifted again. One evening, close to midnight, I received a call. My eldest son's voice came through the line, hoarse and panicked. Dad, I need your help. My chest tightened. What happened? I messed up. Please, can you come get me? The address he gave was on the edge of town, a run-down lot near a string of bars. I didn't tell the others. I just grabbed my coat and drove. When I arrived, I found him leaning against a flickering streetlight, a bruise forming on his cheek. His shirt was torn, his hands scraped. I pulled up and he slid into the passenger seat without a word. We drove in silence for a while. Finally, I asked, Do I need to know what happened? He shook his head. No charges, nothing like that, just old habits. I lost my temper. Again. He turned to me, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can change. Maybe this is just who I am. I tightened my grip on the wheel. That's the easy story to tell yourself. That way you don't have to try. But I've seen you different. The man who sat at my table these last months, that wasn't just a mask. He laughed bitterly. You really think I'm worth saving? I know you're worth saving, I said firmly. But it's not about me believing it. You're going to have to start believing it yourself. When we got back to the house, I didn't lecture him. Instead, I handed him a blanket and let him sleep on the couch. The next morning, my younger son walked into the kitchen and froze at the sight. The look on his face was half anger, half hurt. He pulled me aside later and hissed, You're letting him take over again. How many times are you going to bail him out? I didn't have a perfect answer. Because he's still my son, I told him quietly. And because if I stop reaching for him, I'm afraid I'll lose him for good. That answer didn't satisfy him. I could see the wall going up in his eyes. In that moment, I realized something painful. Healing one bond might mean straining another. It was a balance I didn't yet know how to manage. That evening, after my eldest had left, my daughter pulled me aside. Dad, he needs help. Real help. Not just dinners and second chances. If he's ever going to break this cycle, he has to face it head on. Her words echoed in my head long after she went home. She was right. Love alone wasn't enough. We had to move from hope to action. But how do you convince a grown man, stubborn as the day he was born, to accept help he doesn't want? The following Thursday, I tried a different approach. As we sat at the table, I told a story about a neighbor of mine from years back, a man who drank too much, picked fights, drove his family away. Everyone said he'd die alone, I said. But one day he admitted he couldn't do it himself. He went to a program, got clean, and lived long enough to walk his granddaughter down the aisle. My eldest son stared at his plate, fork unmoving. My daughter glanced at him, then at me. Finally, he muttered, You think that's supposed to be me? I think it could be, I said. If you're willing. The room went quiet. He didn't answer that night, but when he left, He hugged his sister for the first time in years. As I washed the dishes later, I thought about all the years wasted on anger and silence. I thought about the fragile threads holding us together now and how easily they could snap. And I thought about my wife, the way she used to say that family wasn't about being perfect, but about showing up even when you're broken. Maybe that was what we were doing now. Showing up, bruises and all. The weeks that followed were a test for all of us. Small gestures like my eldest son helping in the kitchen, or my younger one choosing to sit in the same room for more than 10 minutes, seemed like victories. But beneath the surface, the question lingered. Would he finally take the step toward change, or would we all find ourselves back where we started? That question weighed on me most at night, when the house was still. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing my wife's voice in the quiet. Don't give up on him, but don't lose the others in the process. It was a thin line to walk, and I wasn't sure I was steady enough to walk it much longer. The breaking point came on a cold Friday. He arrived unannounced, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. My daughter put down her spoon mid-stir. My younger son crossed his arms, bracing for another storm. I motioned for him to sit, but he stood in the doorway like a man on trial. "I can't do it alone," he said, his voice raw. "I thought I could. I thought I'd just keep showing up here and that would fix me. But it's not enough. I need help." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the weight of years, resentment, disappointment, the fragile threads of hope. Then my daughter stepped forward, her hand resting lightly on his arm. "That's the first honest thing you've said in a long time." My younger son didn't move. His eyes stayed on me, searching for my reaction. I swallowed hard. "You've taken the hardest step, son. But saying it isn't enough. You need to follow through." He nodded quickly, almost desperately. "I will, if you'll stand by me." That night, after the others had gone home, I sat with him at the table. We went through the local program's pamphlet together. He looked worn down, like a man twice his age. But for the first time in years, there was no fight in him, only surrender, and maybe the faintest spark of determination. "I'll drive you there on Monday," I said. "But you need to promise me something." He looked up. "What?" "Don't do this just to win us back. Do it because you want to live differently. If you try to fix it for someone else, it won't stick." His eyes filled, and he nodded. "I understand." Over the weekend, my younger son avoided the house. I knew why. Part of him wanted to believe in this change, but the larger part had been burned too many times before. On Sunday, I called him over. We sat on the porch, the winter air sharp against our faces. "Your brother's going into treatment," I said. He did, into answer at first. Then he muttered, "We'll see how long that lasts. I know you don't trust him yet, I can't blame you. But I need you to be here when he comes back. Not for his sake, for mine. I can't carry this alone anymore." That caught him off guard. For the first time he saw the wear on my face, the weight in my shoulders. His tone softened. "I'll try, Dad. That's the best I can give you right now." On Monday morning, I drove my eldest son to the center. Neither of us spoke much. The building loomed ahead, ordinary in shape, but immense in meaning. He paused before stepping out of the car. "You'll come visit?" he asked. "I'll be here," I said simply. He nodded, then walked inside, each step heavy but deliberate. Watching him disappear through those doors, I felt two things at once: fear that he'd falter, and a cautious relief that at least for now, he was facing the truth. That night, the house was quieter than it had been in months. My daughter called to check in, her voice hopeful. My younger son stopped by, sitting across from me in silence. For once, we didn't argue. We didn't talk much either. We just sat there, two men who had been carrying too much, waiting to see if someone they loved could finally carry his own weight. And in that silence, I realized something. The will, the money, the inheritance, those battles had almost broken us. But what mattered wasn't what was written on paper, or who got what. What mattered was whether we could stand in the ruins of all that anger and still choose each other. I don't know how the story ends yet. I don't know if my eldest son will come back stronger, or if we'll face this fight again. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like we're no longer running from the truth. We're walking toward it slowly, haltingly, but together. and maybe that's enough. Sometimes, when the dust finally settles, you realize that life isn't about who betrayed you or who failed to see your worth. It's about how you choose to carry yourself afterward. Dignity isn't something another person can hand to you or take away. It's what you hold on to when the people closest to you leave you doubting. For me, walking through this storm wasn't about revenge or even proving anyone wrong. It was about reclaiming my voice, my peace, and the right to stand in my own truth without apology. And yet the lessons don't end here. Life has a way of testing our resolve in places we least expect, at moments that should be filled with joy, even celebration. If you've ever wondered how far respect can be stretched inside a family, or how one decision can shift the balance of power at a table meant to bring people together, you'll want to hear what happened next. Because the story that begins there changes everything.